Hi folks, my name is Franco Tenelli and this is Science of Singing. In today's file we're going to look upon three types of appoggio. From your letters and from some questions I understood that there is still some confusion about appoggio as it is, and I just want to repeat in more concise way what do I mean by appoggio and how can we use appoggio and what types of appoggio do we know. Let me describe you three types of appoggio and why do we call it appoggio. The first type of appoggio is appoggio sul fiato senza diafragma, perfectly described in an example of Beniamino Gili here on YouTube. It's a falsetto type of singing. In this particular case does not require a diaphragm for producing a beautiful, unstrained and one-timbre voice, because that particular type of voice is very small in volume, so it does not, let me say, push too much on the vocal cords to produce a small but very beautiful sound. So the first type of appoggio we called appoggio sul fiato, so it's on the breath only, on the vocal cords only. The second type of appoggio is when you start using more powerful voice, that is projective voice. In this category we call all classical singers, even including some blues singers or so-called gospel singers who use a passive diaphragm to create more powerful sound, but it's still a passive diaphragm. In those particular styles and in very light operatic styles like Rossini, Mozart, you don't need a very great active opposition of the diaphragm, though it will be even better if you use it, but you don't need it, because all you need is a passive opposition of the diaphragm in all classical singing and opera singing and low abdominals. But only when you get into so-called grand operas, you call grand Rossini opera, but usually among opera singers what we call this starting with some Donizetti and Verdi, of course, and Puccini. In our operatic world, that's what we call grand opera. But of course, in general, grand opera is all Rossini and Mozart and all the styles that you hear in opera. So this big projective style, Verdian style, especially dramatic, requires an additional tool. Basically the tool that you're already using, but with more strength and more activity, because that tool is regulating your pressures on the vocal cords, and it's so-called ultimate appoggio style. One can use this ultimate appoggio style in actually any type of singing, but it only becomes very important when you start singing grand operas, or let's say Verdi, Puccini, because their intensity and projection needed to be so powerful that the old technique that got you away with projecting through relatively smaller and not that intensive orchestra is not good anymore. And you know that, so you're using more resonance because you got one by consciously or subconsciously lowering your larynx. But then this new placement requires a different settings of it's even physically, you have to physically feel a different way when you use so-called ultimate appoggio, and only then you will have sandwich effect when actually your stomach goes like this, right? When you don't use appoggio as an active diaphragm opposition, then of course you will have low abdominal muscle pushing and diaphragm passively has to oppose, but it's a passive opposition, and then you have a particular sound. The goal of any appoggio type is to create one timbral singing, not divided by registers, instrument. So therefore, depending on the style of singing, one uses appoggio accordingly. Crooner uses first type, classical singer second type, and grand opera singer the third type. I would say You should use the third type. Not everybody is using it. As soon as we deal with big resonant sounds, we face not only voice inconsistency, but fast vocal folds fatigue. To avoid that, one should learn, depending on voice type, correct way to reduce the pressure without reducing a resonance. Bringing more control to the sound, being able to sing piano in passaggio and higher. That's one of the problems of the opera singers that got big resonance and the passive opposition of the diaphragm, that they cannot sing piano. Because with passive opposition of the diaphragm, there is no way you can make dynamic changes unless you lose your support. The question remains, why do we have to lean upon, or appoggio, according to Italian school? Why should we lean upon the air or upon the voice? That's what appoggio means. Leaning upon helps us to increase an acoustic space, like in a yawn, to open throat for better resonance. Where the sul fiato senza diafragma or con diafragma prevents larynx from raising and therefore decreasing the space. When your larynx goes in the high notes, you say higher. It goes higher and your space, acoustic space, becomes smaller and smaller, and it will be more difficult to produce a substantial sound with that. And even if you're not opera singer and you're just sul fiato, if the larynx goes really high, then you will not be able to sing it beautifully unless you reduce the sound to a very small sound, and the microphone singers do that. So therefore, when they sing with sul fiato, they don't have to force anything, they just need a necessary projection for the microphone, not more than that. So with a small crooning sound, it is possible without the diaphragm. With bigger sound, we engage diaphragm to help us to control a sound volume that cannot be controlled by just sul fiato and needs additional counterforce. And then finally, dealing with true big sounds, even passively opposing diaphragm cannot work effectively. A singer uses dynamic diaphragmatic control called appoggio. You see, when you are in Grand Opera, you sing Verdi, Puccini. If you want your voice to be consistent and beautiful, you need to take away tensions from the throat. And how do you do it? You do it through counter tension. So, in a small sound, you do it just with the vocal cords. They are able to take the small sound without forcing. The bigger sound goes, the more pressure on vocal cords. The different position also, more low position. And an absolutely controlled airstream with opposition of the diaphragm and very active opposition of the diaphragm, depending on what notes you're singing, what vowels you're singing. And therefore, the appoggio basically becomes the factory of the sound. So the factory of the sound in appoggio singer is here in a Grand Opera. In a sul fiato is here. Okay? In both cases, it can bring a marvelous result depending on what style you're singing, right? If you're singing bossa nova, you're singing jazz, crooning, you don't need that much of appoggio. I would tell you that if you know appoggio, it would even be better for you, but you don't need it. So why would you bother, right? But if you have some ambition to be an opera singer, and especially Grand Opera singer, without using appoggio, your voice will never be at its best. Thank you very much. That was Franco Tenelli, Science of Singing. Bye.